All right. Oh, volume. All right, here we go. Okay, I think everything is working. Everything looks good. All right. So, all right. So we're gonna get started here. If I can turn these. Nope, wrong ones. Why is it the third switch? All right, perfect. Okay. How's my Monday going? So far, pretty hectic. I've got two midterms in on Monday in other classes, and so lots of anxiety about midterms, which is fair. But lots of that's why I'm a couple minutes late. I had students wanting to talk to me, so it's good. Live stream is up. Isn't it risky for everyone to log on to e-class at the same time? Shouldn't there be severe internet issues? There might be some. Sometimes it happens. I honestly, I've been doing it this way for 2 years, and the way I set it up is pretty straightforward. So, and it works pretty well. And a few people have a few internet issues, but overall, it works out okay, right? It takes, yeah. So, I fixed the audio, sort of, which is why I have a headphone in, not because I'm listening to a podcast while lecturing. Um, but yeah, it works. It works. It might take a few times where you have to reload, or we'll talk about it on Monday. We talk about setting up for the exam, but it work. Trust me, it works. Mostly. Okay. Yes, I realized after extensive testing, and I spent like an hour and a half trying to figure out my audio issue, that it was lavalier microphone I was using, which apparently has now died or something has failed on it. So I've ordered a new one, and in the meantime, I'm using one of my wireless headphones. Um, oh no, the practice midterm is not for marks. Basically, it is worth 0% of the final grade, but E-class is stupid. Um, And so I can't set something that says that has no marks assigned to it, right? But it'll basically, whatever you get as a score, it's not going to affect the total grade. So it'll give you a score on it, but it's not due. You don't have to do the practice midterm. It's completely optional. It's up to you whether you want to do it. So don't worry about that. And it doesn't count for anything. So yeah, if you do it, it's no problem. All right, let's talk about some stuff. I think we ended here. I believe. Yes. We ended here. We were talking about rationalization, right? So I ended off sort of talking about, the way that culture can constrain us and the way kind of social organization can constrain us in some ways as well, right? So I ended up talking about Max Weber and his notion of rationalization. So fundamentally, what Weber thinks, and I think this is borne out pretty well, is that modern societies are fundamentally structured around rationality, right? That we've organized societies in the ways that we think are going to be the most efficient, right? So why do we have, a work clock, right? Why do we have an idea of like a 9 to 5 job? Because we think of it as particularly efficient, right? It's an efficient way to organize the working world to get people to come to work at 9 or 8 or whatever and leave at a certain time, right? Why do we have roads that function the way we do, right? We have, roads with traffic lights because it's the most rational way to organize movement through major cities, right? And I was saying that, I was thinking about the concept of rationalization, and I was thinking about my 14-year-old daughter who has a really, really hard time getting up in the morning, right, to go to school. It's a whole schmozzle of many attempts and many missed buses later, and many threats to take away her cell phone if she doesn't make it to the bus that day because I don't want to drive her. Um, it kind of got me thinking about this idea of rationalization. And the way we have school organized, right? Her school starts at 8:30 and it ends at 3:30 is extremely rational, right? It makes sense. It's very efficient to organize it that way so that when I'm at work and my wife is at work, our children are at school. So they're both learning in theory and being taken care of, right? They're being supervised by people. So it's a very efficient system. But my daughter sort of experiences, this mode of rationality as essentially an iron cage, right? Because for her, this doesn't actually work at all, right? It actually is constraining to what she wants to do and what would make her happy, which would be sleeping all of the time, right? So it makes her life akin to she wouldn't put it this way because she's not sociologist and has told me in no uncertain terms that she's not going to be a sociologist no matter what happens. She's going to either own a ranch or be a pastry chef, which is actually two really good professions in some ways. Much better than professional sociologists. So, I mean, probably pays better. So, but she experiences, right, life is kind of an iron cage, right? That she's kind of constrained by the way society has organized her time in a way that isn't very human, right? In a lot of ways, isn't really what fits her natural patterns. And I think this is true of a lot of people, right? The reason people feel like a 9 to 5 job is very constraining, right? That it because it rubs against human nature in some ways. It puts us, on for long periods of time, at the mercy of bosses and such. And it's not a very human way to be in a lot of ways. Okay, all you want to know is about the test. No interest in the sociology. So sad. Yeah, culture will be the last unit for the exam for sure. If it isn't set up so you can do it more than once, I will shift it so you can do it unlimited times. There's not a huge bank of practice questions in this one. I'm hoping to add a few more. Um, I just kind of went with what I had. So you might see a lot of questions repeat, but I'll try to add some tomorrow when I have a little bit of time to work. And yeah, I'll make sure you have unlimited. I don't know if you do now, but I can double check. Okay. So consumerism, right? And this is especially from, say, a conflict theory or Marxist point of view. Consumerism, in lots of ways, is also seen as a sort of cultural constraint. So, and I mean, this is where, culture has these two faces. Consumerism, in some ways, can allow us to express ourselves, right? The clothes you buy, the things you wear, the kind of car you have, this kind of cell phone you end up buying, right? Are you, I mean, I think this was maybe more the case a few years ago, when cell phones were really, they had some cachet and people would line up at the Apple store. God, I don't miss those days at all. People would line up at the Apple store when the new iPhone 5 launched because they wanted to be the first ones to get their hands on an iPhone to show their status as, sheep people, or whatever. So there's this big thing like, oh, I'm an Apple user or I'm an Android user or whatever, right? And I remember flame wars online with people yelling about sheeple and robots and all sorts of things, right? I sheep or whatever it happens to be. So we have a lot of ability to express who we are through consumerism. So it has an element of freedom. There's also an element of constraint in a lot of ways, right? We sort of end up buying into identities that are prepackaged for us and trying to fit ourselves into these identities, right? I mean, I don't know where all of you are at. Probably not at the same level as junior high girls, but I know amongst my daughter's friend group, there is a running battle right now as to are you a Swiftie or not? And if you're not, do you have some kind of lessened moral status? The Swifties seem to have the cultural high ground at the moment. And as we know from the Star Wars movies, once you're standing slightly higher than someone else, there's no way to win. Right, but this is the big competition kind of going on in her friend group is like, are you a Swiftie or aren't you a Swiftie? And if you're not a Swiftie, you're somehow you haven't adopted this identity. But being a Swiftie comes along with all of these identitarian sort of things, like really being obsessed and loving Taylor Swift, and trying to force your parents to get you tickets to the Eras tour somewhere in the world. I mean, my wife's cousin, her daughter is a huge Swiftie, and I think they enlisted like 10 different families in an effort to get her tickets um, to the Eras tour, and they got tickets finally in Vancouver. Cost, yeah, anyway, doesn't matter. But yeah, I mean, there's so much bound into this idea that you are a Taylor Swift fan, right? It's become an identity, right? And you can think of that in lots of ways, right? How often do people turn consumer products into sort of identities? And it locks you in a sense, to um, the identities that are presented to you in a commercial way, right? And so you're somewhat not in control of your identity, right? If being a Swiftie means you have to adopt certain things, then ultimately, being a Swiftie is a form of slavery. No, I'm kidding. It's not quite that bad. Um, but you're buying into an sorry, that was a terrible joke, and I went for it wholeheartedly. You can tell what I think of Taylor Swift. She's fine. She's fine. She's okay. She has like four good songs. That's all I'm saying. I'm kidding. No, I'm actually not. I'm not a big Taylor Swift fan. I'm being not a teenage girl. It just doesn't ring true with me. But I'm looking forward to her next breakup song where she denounces the NFL. That's my, you know, well, talks about how sports guys are just complete jerks. Or, when what's the conspiracy right now that she's being groomed by the Pentagon to endorse Joe Biden, which is also a fun conspiracy. Her and her boyfriend, what is it, Travis Kelsey? I don't even care. Um, but why do I know? Because no one will shut up about it. Um, that they're being groomed by the Pentagon, and after he wins the Super Bowl, he's gonna be like, "This one's for you, JoJo," and endorse Joe Biden. Anyway, it'll be fun. They'll do it together as they get engaged on the field or something stupid. That'd be fun. Okay, so right, we do get locked into consumerist identities, right? Things that are built by brands. Okay, the other thing, and this is a very Marxist critique, that consumers ultimately are motivated to buy by advertising, right? By ads that are constantly in our face and all over the place that encourage us to shop till we drop, right? And I love this little graphic, right? Because these are the stages of consumerism, right? You need this thing, but I have a few things like that. Everyone else has one. Well, then I should have one. The thing will change your life, right? And really buy it now, which I feel like is every Apple advertising campaign. And I'm really critical of Apple because fundamentally they are the most evil company ever created. I'm kidding. That's Microsoft. Um, or Google. Is it Google? It could be Google or Facebook. Now I don't know. They're all pretty evil. But right, this is the Apple advertising campaigns, right? You need the thing, right? You need the iPhone 14 Pro, but I already have an iPhone, right? But everyone else is getting one. Well, I guess I need one too. I guess the camera is slightly better and the processor is slightly faster. Actually, no. It will change your life. And I love this, right? I remember they had one ad for Apple where it was my least favorite thing ever because it was just unconstrained corporate propaganda. Where they had this kid, and he's the family gathering at Christmas time, and he's always on his. I about said a bad word. He was always on his phone the whole time, and then it's revealed at the end that he was actually making a home movie about his family. And look how the iPhone transformed this family and captured their moments on a video forever, and made them closer when they all realized how much they love each other or something. Right? I remember this ad. I should play it for you. It's terrible. Makes me want to vomit. Um, but and it keeps you in the market always buying things, right? Never really reflecting on what's involved in the purchases or the fact that you have to keep going to work to buy yet another what? How expensive are iPhones now? Like one kidney, or as like $1,500. You could probably get more for a kidney. Okay. Yeah, ties. I was talking about this a second ago, right? Tying identity to purchases, right? People wear brands, right? People wear brands. Why? Because fundamentally, it's supposed to say something about them. And good for you. I'm like looking out in the crowd, and like almost no one has branded clothing, and I'm like, oh, you guys, y'all are doing good. You have a U of A shirt, so do you. My critique is always with buying U of A merch is like, look, you already pay for the school. Do you have to buy the merch as well? Um, I'm very snarky when it comes to U of A stuff because every year I get a message from the Alumni Association telling me if I just donated, how much I could change students' lives. And I'm like, but I'm already doing that for the worse in class. No, I'm kidding. Also, I have to pay for parking every month for the pleasure of coming to work here. So that's my donation as an alumnus. The, the hive mind of Taylor fans, Taylor Swift fans, they're Swifties. Get it right. Scares you. You got to refer to them properly or they get mad at you. Okay, I have a teenage daughter. What part of this did you miss? This is all she talks about, I think. I liked it much better when it was My Little Pony. That worked much better for me. Uh, I don't know what that means. I, I'm gonna go with no. What did Apple do to me? Uh, you know, I don't know. I can't tell you what Apple did to me. I just have a visceral reaction to its corporate propaganda. Drake is greater than Taylor, sure. The Man by Taylor Swift. I will. I think a student tried to convince me Taylor Swift is great by giving me the was it 3 a.m. Um, I don't know. Is it on that disc? It's in my car and I've never listened to it. And it's been a year. The Man, I'll try. All phones are expensive now, though. That is not true. I bought a Pixel 7a because it was decent and cheap, and it only cost me like $400. So it was not bad. It was on sale. It was awesome. Um, what did Apple do to me? They hurt me by taking my money. And then 2 years later, being like, "Your phone sucks. Give us more money." What are my thoughts on Kanye? A lovely, lovely artist who clearly has bipolar disorder. Pretty clearly, like just says things when he's in an episode. That's my opinion. I think he has bipolar. Is that how you spell Kelsey? Cool. Did not know that. Ah, all right. Okay. The silliness is it's good. It's fun. Let's have some fun. Okay. My opinion on car culture and people customizing them to make them unique. I mean, I guess. I mean, there's certainly some people that want to turn a car into a statement, right? Mostly again with things that they buy. But for most people, right, what's more important with the car is the brand and what it says about where you fall on the wealth scale. Like, do you have an Audi? Then clearly you're rich or something. Or you like cars that break down frequently. I only say this because I have a friend. He is rich. He bought an Audi, drove it for 6 months. It blew an alternator, and then it spent the next 6 months in the garage because they're like, we need to ship in a part from Germany, and they're back ordered. So then he ended up driving a Hyundai that they rented him for 6 months, and he was a very happy person. I'll say that. I these sound like words, but they're not. What are thoughts on Bunwich in cab? I have no opinion on it. I try not to eat food prepared on campus as a general rule. I really don't know what this means. I'm assuming this is like Megan Thee Stallion and Nicki Minaj. Um, but if there is some kind of tiff between them, the level of my indifference cannot be measured. Um, I'll put it that way. Okay, on to other things. Oh, yes, indifference. Okay, subcultures. So what are subcultures? So subcultures basically are groups that adhere to some kind of specific set of values or norms and practices within the larger cultures, right? Yeah. So basically, you can think of something. Car culture would probably be a kind of a subculture, right? It's people taking cars, customizing them to make them say something unique, right? But still adhering to the basic kind of premise that you should buy things, right? That you should be part of consumer society, that brands and cars and things speak to particular identities. Um, there's a lot of purchasing. These guys, I mean, they're not around as much as they used to be. These are bronies. I went through a bit of a like research fascination with bronies when my daughter was like 4 years old, and I realized that she was watching My Little Pony, and then I realized that somehow there were a bunch of 30-year-old men who also watched My Little Pony, and I could not stop with my fascination of them. And so like yeah, I read up on this. I watched documentaries. Considered attending BronyCon just to be like the is happening. But what are bronies, right? They're a subculture, right? They basically have taken an aspect of the kind of popular culture and turned it into an identity, right? And how do they build this? And they have certain values within it, right? The bronies were fun because they were like all about friendship and camaraderie and appropriating things that are better left to 4-year-old girls. I'm sorry if you're a brony. I don't mean to offend. I tell, I riz on everyone, so I'm mean to everyone all the time. You should ask my children. My favorite my favorite line is my daughter will say, "That's not funny." I'm like, "Ah, it's pretty funny from here," which she does not appreciate in the slightest. Okay, right. They're basically taking aspects of pop culture and consumer culture, right? And they build an identity and expression, right? So this guy bought his pink pants and his pink vest and his pink wig, right, through some kind of consumer purchase, right? And this lady here, right, she's dressed, I think, as a pony or a dragon. I don't really know. And they all got these things commercially, and they've built a kind of, identity around purchasing My Little Pony stuff, or on being in a My Little Pony themed community, right? Discussing things online, and they exist that way. And you can think of like, sci-fi fans, like Star Trek fans and Star Wars fans, in the same way, right? Where they have like conventions, or superhero fans, right? And things like Comic Con. They've built identities out of these bigger cultural materials, and generally they're a little bit offbeat in terms of the culture, so they exist within the culture as a kind of subset. Countercultures are a different story, because countercultures, well, they look a lot like subcultures in some ways. Generally, they're subcultures that seek to, oppose, and sometimes to replace the dominant values of a society, right? So I got a couple examples for you. The punks, if we think about the 1970s, especially in Britain, and kind of early hip hop culture. So the punks, right? What was the punk movement? It was especially prominent in places like Birmingham, England, and in like Manchester as well, like working class places. And the punks sort of emerge as a working class movement, right? They're a bunch of, especially white men, who are sort of left behind by the transformation in the British economy that happens in the 1970s, in a slow shift away from manufacturing and labor jobs, more to service and kind of higher tech jobs in general, right? So they're dispossessed young men. And so what do, right? They basically kind of adopt an inherent kind of socialism, right? They end up being very socialistic and very opposed to kind of capitalist culture in general. And they express this and especially things like the plight of the working class, and how the working class is seen as this like wholesome thing, but ultimately they feel like exploited by the system. So what do the punks do? Right? They take a bunch of the symbols of the working class. I think I talked about this last time, like blue jeans, right? Blue jeans were, in up until the 1970s, really a working class kind of pant, right? People who worked in manufacturing and labor wore jeans. Why? Because they're relatively resilient, right? Especially if you wear like those thick Wrangler type ones. It feels like you're walking around in cardboard pants the whole day. But they're thick and they're durable, right? Which is why people who worked outside and worked, in manual labor wore jeans, whereas people who were more professional wore slacks and khakis and other forms of pants. So they took this symbol of the working class and said, we're rejecting working class values, and how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to stick these jeans in with all sorts of chemicals to bleach them out, and we're going to rip them and kind of make them useless, right? They're now useless as a working pant, to show how much we reject, working class values. And they did the same thing with like leather jackets, right? And all sorts of things. They put spikes and pins and pegs through them, right? They dyed their hair in weird colors to reject normalcy, and made all kinds of music that was very oppositional. It was loud. It was aggressive. It was meant to kind of sound bad in some ways, right? To reject kind of middle class notions about what good music sounded like, right? So the punks were a kind of counterculture, right? They wanted to bring down capitalism fundamentally. Hip hop is kind of similar, right? Early hip hop culture, and I think I said this last time as well, is very much about rejecting middle class values, especially what's seen as white values, right? They talk a lot about drug use, a lot about crime, a lot about, well, mostly those things. Exorbitant spending, treating women poorly, to put it mildly. Um, you know, Use words that otherwise would not be okay in polite company, right? Referring to women in derisive and derogatory ways, and referring especially to other black people, using a particular word that if I said it in class, I would probably get fired. So it starts with the letter N, if you're wondering. Uh, and that is as far as I'm going to go with it. Right now, it was about opposing things like the police, right, and the system, and banks, and all of these kinds of things. Killing police was a common theme as well. all, and you find this in terms of like, people like who I've never listened to two syllables of their music. I'm sorry, like Tupac, and all of any early hip hop culture. I guess I've listened to some Snoop Dogg. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So that's a counterculture, right? It's about opposing the values of the dominant culture. So how does, and this sounds like a freedom, right? You take the things that consumer culture gives you, you know, leather jackets and jeans, gold chains, or whatever in hip hop culture, cars, right? Fancy cars in particular, and you turn them into symbols of opposition. That sounds like freedom. But there's also a form of constraint built into countercultures, and that is that they're very quickly, typically taken over and tamed, right? Like if you look at punk today, right? Punk by the 1980s was tamed, right? So what happened, right, is basically, punk artists started to record things and put it out on like bootleg tapes, and record companies really quickly realized that there was a market for punk music. And then clothing retailers realized that this particular style of the punks, toned down a little, actually had a lot of resonance with young people and could be sold to them. So what did they do is they moved into that territory, right? So the record labels went and signed a bunch of punk artists, right? Not the really hardcore edgy people, but some of them did get signed and sort of ended up being domesticated in some ways. And their music stopped being so anti-establishment. They toned things down a little bit. And the market then got flooded by a bunch of like punk music that was probably kind of appealing to slightly angry middle class teenagers in Britain and America, right? And it got diluted, right? So all of a sudden, whatever countercultural message was in punk sort of got washed away a little bit. And hip hop was kind of similar, right? If you look at, hip hop in the early days, it's much more anti-establishment than it is today, right? Or today, it's been fundamentally really kind of made palatable. And it's now really popular with, middle class white kids all over, America and Canada, in ways that probably those original hip hop artists would have found confusing, that it would resonate with them so much, right? And again, it was very much a working class or poor kind of cultural movement, right? So yeah, consumerism actually acts as a kind of control mechanism, right? It prevents countercultures from developing too much and from disrupting the social order by essentially turning them into products to sell, right? And you can buy, what amounts to, the sort of clothing that's associated with punk or hip hop at West Edmonton Mall today, which suggests, right, that we've gone some ways down to the domestication of these things. Okay, hang on, gotta go. As possible. Thoughts on Ice Spice? Yes? No? I don't know what Ice Spice is. I'm sorry. Um, uh, I have been accused of secretly being a furry, but never secretly being a brony. I take umbrage. Umbrage, I say. I'm not a secret brony. Though I will say, when my daughter was growing up, My Little Pony Friendship is Magic was one of the only shows that she had on that didn't make me want to gouge out my eyes with a spoon. Um, Certainly better than Dora the Explorer. I will say that. Lee. Okay. The Young Thug. Okay. This is a primal grunt of some kind. Gra. Sounds like Klingon. Ta pa ta be. All right. They're like, "Do you speak Klingon?" And I'm like, "Yes, some." I was not the most popular kid in my high school. Strangely, is consumerism and subculture a part of rationalization, or is like rationalization is a different topic? We're now talking about subcultures and consumerism. Okay, forward. Okay. Oh, we got lots of time. Lots and lots of time. Okay. So cultural capital. So cultural capital is another way that culture constrains us, right? So what is cultural capital? So I mean, any kind of capital, right? It's something that you possess, right? So you can have like money. If you have lots of money, that's a form of capital. Social capital. If you have social capital, right? You know lots of people. You have social connections that you can use to make your life better. Cultural capital is kind of similar, except it has to do with how easily you're able to navigate particular cultural situations, right? Um, so basically, cultural capital, right, is the beliefs, tastes, norms, and values that people draw upon in everyday life. What does that mean, right? It means that, it's things like etiquette, language, knowledge, cultural facility that you can use in your life to navigate the world and hopefully to get you ahead, right? So, what is cultural? So, this is people with different socialization histories occupy different social positions and have different amounts and types of cultural capital. What does that mean, right? Okay, okay. How do we explain this? Depending on where you were socialized, what you know, how you were taught certain things, there's an argument to be made that you're able to navigate certain situations better or worse, right? Because you know how to speak to people and you know how to act in certain spaces. There's a guy named Pierre Bourdieu. He talks about this, in particular, he talks about it in terms of teachers. And one of the things that Bourdieu observed was that teachers, because they were these professionals, tended to come from the middle class, right? They tended to be sort of, yeah, they weren't in the elites because the elites do other things, but they were kind of solidly in the middle class. And so they brought with them into the classrooms they taught a bunch of middle class values around things like etiquette. How do you talk to people? How do you behave in a classroom? What is okay to do? Like, what language is okay to use? How should you address your teacher? Right? How should you address adults? What relationships should you have with them? Is it good to learn? What's your opinion on reading? All of these sorts of values they brought with them into the classroom. And for Bourdieu, when they interacted with middle class kids who had been raised with those same values, things went pretty well for those kids, right? Because they shared similar values with the teacher, right? And they knew how to address the teacher, they knew how to talk to adults, because it was the same way that they talked to their parents and other adults in their lives. So they had a kind of cultural facility in that. When they interacted with working class kids, things got a little bit dicier, according to Bourdieu. Why? Well, because they spoke differently, right? They had different norms around language. And I mean, it's not as much here, though there definitely are sort of working class ways of speaking and kind of say middle class and elite ways of speaking even now. But let's say if you went somewhere like France or England, right, there's very distinct accents, depending on your social class, especially in the UK, right? And so when people spoke, they spoke in a different way that didn't interact with the teachers well. They might not have known the polite ways of address as much or how to navigate according to values. And so teachers tended to treat them worse and they tended to have worse educational outcomes. And this is true, according to Bourdieu, across large swaths of life, right? When you go into the workplace, you're going to bring a certain degree of cultural capital, right? Um, you're going to give a sort of, impression to people in how you speak, how you dress, how you address people, how you know how to navigate, what kind of knowledge do you have, right? If you have a boss that is really like a golf fanatic and you're a golf fanatic too, or you're a good golfer, and you're able to, um, go golfing with your boss and hold a conversation, you have a lot of cultural capital in that particular situation. And there's a chance your boss is going to like you and promote you, right? Now, if you're like me and the only set of golf clubs you have is a set of golf clubs that you found in the back of a rental car when you worked at a rental car company and you just kept them because nobody ever claimed them, you're going to have a whole lot less cultural capital in that situation. But I have a lot of cultural capital in general, right? Why? Because I'm a professor. I have a PhD, which impresses people. I don't know why. It really shouldn't, trust me. I've met as many deeply stupid professors as any class of people. I've met smarter plumbers, honestly. Plumbers are phenomenally smart. They do amazing things. And I honestly was having a conversation with a professor from the history department, and like last week, and I swear I've never met a stupider person. Like honestly, like 100%. I won't tell you who. I was not impressed. Anyway. But I mean, I'm sure he could walk into a room and be like, "I am Professor da 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 da." That's not his actual name. And people would be very impressed, right? Because he has a PhD, he's smart, he speaks very well, and has wonderful elocution. That's a form of cultural capital that, say, maybe my friend Matt, who's a plumber, and comes into my house in ripped, Carhartts and a dirty shirt. doesn't have, right? Certainly not in the space of like if I brought him here to this classroom, he would not have the same cachet as me standing up here. Now, as it goes, in kind of working class setting, he has a lot of cultural capital where I wouldn't have any because me trying to fix something ends up with me phoning my friend Matt. I'll put it that way. I'm like, Matt, how do I fix this? That's cultural capital, right? He has a lot of cultural capital in kind of a working class setting. Take him into a school, a university, or a fancy restaurant, and suddenly his cultural capital is a lot different, right? It's a lot reduced. Whereas mine, in a working class setting, they're going to look at me like an alien with three heads because I don't know how to work a power drill. I do know how to work a drill. I'm just not very good at it. Saw, on the other hand, is going to end up with me with three fingers. Um, so I have no cultural capital there. Put me at the university, suddenly I'm Professor Broussard, and everybody at least acts like they respect me and find my jokes funny. Right? So that's cultural capital at the end of the day, right? It's symbolic, right? It's not material, but it plays an important role in where you sit in society and how you're able to navigate through spaces, right? And yeah, definitely having, say, a master's or a PhD, comes with a lot of kind of cultural capital, right? That you can impress people in certain circumstances, though not when you're trying to build a shelf. Okay. Oh, how are we doing here? I'm gonna go see if I have any questions. Do do do. Yeah, subculture is kind of, yeah, like a culture within a culture, kind of a smaller unit below the kind of main culture. But subcultures are not opposed to culture; they just use aspects of the culture. Countercultures are also subcultures, but they are subcultures that oppose the dominant cultures. Okay, so I will tell you exactly on Friday, but it'll cover, sorry, the midterm. Everyone wants to know about the midterm. I know you're all worried about it. Midterm will cover like concepts and theories, social research, and culture. So I think that's only 3 chapters. I think it's maybe chapters 1 to 3, but I'll double check because I don't have the table of contents in the textbook memorized. Socialization could have been on it, but we're not going to cover it. We're going to bump it to the second midterm, and it'll be fine. Right? So only stuff we talked about in class. Don't worry about anything we didn't talk about in class. I'm not going to make you learn stuff on your own that I'm going to test you on. That's stupid and not fair. So trust me. Yes, absolutely. That's a great example. Yeah, so like eating with your fingers, and again, it depends on the setting, right? Eating with your fingers at McDonald's is fine, right? Eating with your fingers at La Ronde, a restaurant that turns around on the top of the hotel downtown, I think is going to get you some funny looks, right? You probably need to use one of the 17 forks or knives that are presented to you at that restaurant, right? Eating with your fingers, again, with a bunch of kindergartners is going to be fine. Eating with your fingers, if you're with King Charles, is going to show your lack of cultural capital, right? So yes, that is exactly right. Great example. Okay. Is cultural capital something individuals have less or more of? Like one person has less cultural capital than another? Okay, yes, and also no, which is the clearest answer I've ever given. Yes, in certain circumstances, right? In certain circumstances, a person who's sort of raised in, like oh, I'm trying to think of an example here, right? Like again, like a university, right? A person who has a PhD there is going to carry a lot of cultural capital. A person who has a 2-year certificate in administration is going to have less, right? However, let's say a circumstance like on a job site, the journeyman plumber is going to have a lot, and he knows a lot about football and, loves football and sports, and he's really able to converse with the other people. He knows how to build things. He knows how to fix his own car, right? That person's going to have a lot more or cultural capital in a working class space like a job site than a professor would. Why? Because the professor fundamentally doesn't know how to do anything, right? I shouldn't say that. I knew a professor who built his own house, so clearly he had skills, but generally we're pretty useless. After the zombie apocalypse, no one's going to be like, "Where's the professors at?" It's going to be like, "Yeah, can anyone find a plumber or soldier or useful person? You, professor, you just go hide over there and get eaten." That's how it's going to go after the zombie apocalypse. I've played enough zombie games to know this is how it goes. Um, yes, the amount of cultural capital you have varies depending on the situation you're in, and it's class dependent, it's site dependent, and obviously, right, like certain places will have less potential for like economic advancement, right? A plumber has less room for economic advancement than a banker, right? Bankers can make way more money, and part of that is what cultural capital you're bringing into those spaces too. Okay, oh boy, it's a hard concept. So yes, in certain circumstances. Cultural capital, yeah. So again, in different cultural capital related to academic intelligence versus practical in certain spaces, right? In the university, academic intelligence is going to be much more valued than real life intelligence, right? But in a on a again on a job site, practical knowledge is going to be much more useful than being able to talk to people about Foucault. Okay, people can cultural capital be faked? People fake cultural capital all the time. Absolutely, people do, right? When someone is, and sometimes this gets you smacked down a little bit, right? Because if you're speaking above your station, right, you're speaking in a way where you're being too hoity-toity, and clearly people know that you don't have, say, the knowledge to back it up. Absolutely, but also people who like fake degrees, right? Like, and my boss was telling me about someone who had served as a professor for 15 years, but had never actually earned a PhD, but had like hundreds of published articles. They faked their credentials. They put it on their resume that they'd never done a PhD program, got hired somehow. I don't know how. Brilliant. And then ultimately, when it was discovered, it was like, oh, that's fake cultural capital. They got fired. Yeah, please. So then in that situation, would something like stolen valor also be kind of like faking culture capital in a sense? I'm not 100% like, I kind of know what you mean by stolen valor, but I'm. It's like, faking Oh yeah, absolutely. You're going for a form of like cultural capital that you don't have, right? And yeah, people do this all the time. Now, if it's ever discovered, you're in trouble. But yeah, you can pretend you have a form of cultural capital because if you're like, yeah, I served in Iraq, right? People are going to think a certain thing about you. Okay, let me see if I can get through a few more of these questions and then let you go. Uh, would the higher would work hierarchy also go hand in? For example, healthcare doctors are the highest point. Yeah, MDs have more cultural capital than nurses, and this drives nurses crazy, by the way. So basically, cultural capital is norms or thinking in different classes. It's the value attached to certain ways of acting, being, and certain kind of non-tangible possessions like credentials in different classes and settings. Okay, since you're all leaving anyway, let's call it a day.